Black man accused of stealing his own car. What the officer did next shocked everyone. The flash of steel under the streetlight caught Jamal's eye as multiple weapons trained on his chest. Time seemed to freeze in that moment, the warm summer air thick with tension, the distant church bells marking midnight and Mrs. Johnson's heart-wrenching scream piercing the night. Officer Karen Michaels' hand trembled on her weapon, and as she shifted her stance, a small Bible slipped from her pocket, landing open at Psalm 34, the same passage Jamal's mother had read to him the day she died. "God, please," he whispered, his mother's cross burning against his chest, "help them see me as you do." In that split second, before darkness or light would prevail, Jamal caught a glimpse of the tears streaming down Karen's face, and something deep within him knew this night would change everything, not just for him, but for every soul present on Cherry Oak Lane. Hey everyone, before we dive into today's story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you find this content interesting, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to support the channel and never miss our upcoming exciting stories. Thank you all so much. Cherry Oak Lane had always been more than just a street in the affluent neighborhood of Millbrook Heights. It was a testament to the American dream. Among its grand houses and manicured lawns lived Jamal Freeman, a 26-year-old law student whose recent purchase of a sleek black Porsche represented not just success, but a promise he'd made to his late mother. Sarah Freeman had raised Jamal alone, working double shifts as a nurse while battling leukemia. Even in her final days, she'd never lost her faith, teaching Jamal that love could overcome any darkness. "Remember, baby," she'd whispered from her hospital bed 3 months ago, "when they see your skin before your soul, that's their burden to bear, not yours." Her cross now hung around his neck, a constant reminder of her wisdom. Just across the street lived Mrs. Eleanor Johnson, a 68-year-old widow whose elegant posture belied the weight of her own tragedy. 5 years ago, her son Marcus had been killed during a routine traffic stop, a fact she carried silently, like a stone in her heart. She watched Jamal coming and going, seeing in him the shadow of her own boy, but fear had taught her the price of speaking up. Officer Karen Michaels patrolled these streets with a different kind of pain. At 42, she carried herself with rigid authority, masking the wounds of losing her mixed-race son, Tommy, in a custody battle that had left her bitter and broken. Her ex-husband, a prominent white lawyer, had convinced the court that she was unstable code for being a white mother who'd loved a black man and lost her way. Tommy's photo remained in her cruiser, next to her service weapon. The local St. Augustine's Church stood at the end of Cherry Oak Lane, where Father Thomas Richardson had served for 30 years. His weathered face and gentle demeanor made him a confidant to all from Jamal, who came to pray with his mother's photo, to Karen, who slipped into late-night services seeking solace. The church's stone walls held countless whispered prayers and unspoken fears. Officer James Davis, the youngest of the local police force at 29, brought a different perspective to the streets he patrolled. As the son of Pastor Davis from the neighboring county, he'd been raised on Scripture and social justice in equal measure. His father's words echoed in his mind, "The badge means nothing if it's not worn over a heart of service." The community itself was changing. Old money mixed with new success, creating invisible lines between those who'd always belonged and those who'd earned their place. The weekly farmers' market bustled with forced pleasantries, while real estate signs sprouted like weeds, each one promising exclusive living while whispering unspoken questions about who belonged and who didn't. Jamal's Porsche, parked in front of his colonial-style home, became a symbol of these changes. To some, it represented progress, a young black professional living his dream. To others, it was an intrusion, a crack in the carefully maintained facade of their community's character. Each Sunday, these lives intersected at St. Augustine's, where Father Thomas preached about unity while his congregation sat in their unofficially segregated pews. Mrs. Johnson would dab her eyes during hymns that reminded her of Marcus. Karen would grip her service bulletin until it crumpled, fighting tears when prayers mentioned children. and Jamal would touch his mother's cross, remembering her words about forgiveness being the ultimate act of strength. The air on Cherry Oak Lane had grown thick with unspoken words and unshed tears. Each resident carried their own story of loss, love, and prejudice, like invisible badges beneath their carefully pressed clothes. They nodded politely at neighborhood meetings, discussed property values in school districts, all while deeper currents of fear, guilt, and hope swirled beneath the surface. None of them could have known that on this warm summer evening, as the sun painted the expensive cars and perfect lawns in shades of gold, their carefully maintained world was about to shatter. The pieces would fall in ways none of them expected, forcing each to confront not just each other but the truths they'd buried deep within themselves. The evening air hummed with cicadas as Jamal's Porsche purred down Cherry Oak Lane. He'd just left the library after another late study session, his mind still wrestling with constitutional law cases. The flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror shattered his contemplation, a sight that made his mother's cross feel suddenly heavy against his chest. Officer Karen Michaels had been watching the black Porsche from her cruiser, her fingers drumming against the steering wheel. The car matched a report of high-end vehicle thefts in the area, but something else nagged at her, a deeper, darker impulse she didn't want to acknowledge. As she approached the vehicle, her hand instinctively rested on her holster, just as it had the last time she'd seen her son Tommy. License and registration, she demanded, her flashlight beam invasively scanning the car's interior. The leather seats still had that new car smell, mixing with the faint scent of the roses Jamal had bought for his mother's grave earlier that day. From her porch, Mrs. Johnson watched the scene unfold, her heart racing as memories of Marcus flooded back. She gripped her screen door handle, frozen between intervention and self-preservation. The sound of more cruisers approaching sent a chill down her spine. Officer Jamal spoke calmly, remembering his mother's words about dignity under pressure. "I live just there, at number 42. I've been here for 2 years now." His law books lay visible on the passenger seat, but Karen's eyes skipped past them, fixed instead on his hands as he reached for his wallet. The gathering neighbors created an audience neither had asked for. Mr. Peterson from number 38 muttered something about property values while his wife clutched her pearls. Young families hurried their children inside, doors clicking shut like judgments being passed. Father Thomas, returning from evening prayers, paused at the church steps. The scene before him was all too familiar, a tableau of prejudice he'd prayed wouldn't touch his congregation. He began walking slowly toward the growing tension, his collar a stark white against the darkening sky. "Step out of the vehicle," Karen ordered, her voice carrying a tremor she hoped no one else could hear. The photo of Tommy in her pocket seemed to burn against her leg. "We've had reports of stolen vehicles matching this description." As Jamal carefully opened his door, a breeze caught the pages of his constitutional law notebook, fluttering to the section on Fourth Amendment rights, a bitter irony not lost on him. The roses in his passenger seat dropped a petal red against black leather like a tear of blood. Officer Davis's cruiser pulled up last, his arrival marking a crucial moment none of them yet understood. He recognized Jamal from the youth mentorship program at his father's church, but remained silent, watching his fellow officers' behavior with growing concern. The neighborhood held its collective breath as Jamal stood beneath the streetlight, hands visible, dignity intact, while Karen's flashlight beam traced his outline like an artist sketching shadows. In that moment, Cherry Oak Lane wasn't just a street, it was a battleground where personal pain and societal prejudice collided, setting in motion events that would force them all to confront the demons they thought they'd buried beneath their manicured lawns and polite smiles. Mrs. Johnson's wind chimes tinkled in the breeze, their gentle song a stark contrast to the harsh reality unfolding before her. She thought of Marcus, of all the times she'd stayed silent, and felt something inside her begin to crack. The weight of years of silence pressed against her chest like a stone. The tension on Cherry Oak Lane crystallized as a senior officer's cruiser rolled to a stop, its headlights casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. Lieutenant Roberts, a veteran of 20 years, stepped out with the weary confidence of someone who'd seen too much. His arrival should have brought calm, but instead the air grew heavier with unspoken accusations. Karen's grip on her flashlight tightened when she noticed something glinting around Jamal's neck. The cross identical to the one she'd given Tommy on his 10th birthday, the last time she'd seen her son. The sight sent a jolt through her body, momentarily cracking her professional facade. "That necklace," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Where did you get it?" Jamal's hand instinctively moved to touch his mother's cross, but the motion caused every officer to tense. "It was my mother's," he said carefully, his words carrying across the unnaturally quiet street. "She wore it during her rounds at Mercy Hospital. She was a nurse there for 20 years. The mention of Mercy Hospital hit Karen like a physical blow. 15 years ago, she'd been rushed there after a drunk driver hit her car. A kind nurse had held her hand through the night, praying with her as they waited to see if Tommy would survive. The memory had blurred over time, but the nurse's gentle voice remained clear. "Faith sees best in the dark, dear." Mrs. Johnson's screen door creaked open, drawing all eyes to her porch. Her steps were hesitant but determined as she descended, each footfall carrying the weight of years of silence. I remember Sarah Freeman. Her voice quavered but grew stronger. "She was there the night they brought my Marcus in. She stayed with me until her words trailed off, but their impact rippled through the gathering." Officer Davis moved closer, his pastor father's teachings about divine timing echoing in his mind. He'd been a rookie the night Marcus Johnson died, too new to do anything but watch in horror. Now, standing in the glow of police lights, he saw a chance for redemption. Lieutenant Roberts studied the scene, his experienced eyes noting Karen's trembling hands, Jamal's careful stillness, and the growing crowd of neighbors. Among them stood Father Thomas, his collar reflecting the flashing lights like a beacon. The priest's presence seemed to amplify the moral weight of the moment. Officer Michaels Roberts began, but Karen cut him off. "He matches the description," she insisted, her voice brittle. "Black male, expensive car, late night," but even as she spoke, her words sounded hollow, overwhelmed by the ghost of her own prejudices. Jamal remained still, his mother's last words playing in his mind. "They'll try to make you angry, baby, but anger is a luxury we can't afford. Show them the strength of dignity." The law books in his car seemed to mock him, all those constitutional rights reduced to theory in the face of raw prejudice. From her new position at the bottom of her porch steps, Mrs. Johnson saw something that stopped her heart. In Jamal's back seat lay a bouquet of yellow roses, Marcus's favorite, the same flower she'd placed on her son's grave that morning. The coincidence felt like a divine nudge, breaking the last chains of her silence. "Karen Michaels," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of age and suffering. "I remember when you first moved to Cherry Oak Lane. You were so proud of Tommy, showing his pictures to everyone at the church social. What would that young mother think of who you've become?" The words struck Karen like physical blows. The memory of herself, younger and full of hope, holding Tommy's hand at church socials, believing love could conquer all prejudices. Before the divorce, before the custody battle, before bitterness had corrupted her heart. Father Thomas moved forward, his presence creating a buffer between the officers and Jamal. "We're better than this," he said softly. "All of us. We come to church every Sunday, pray for peace, for understanding. But here we are, treating one of our own like a stranger." The neighbors shifted uncomfortably, their own complicity in silent prejudices suddenly exposed. Mr. Peterson lowered his phone, no longer recording but watching with growing shame. His wife's hand dropped from her pearls, remembering how she'd clutched them the same way when the Freemans first moved in. Officer Davis stepped forward, duty wrestling with conscience. "Lieutenant, I know Jamal. He volunteers at my father's youth center. He's studying for the bar exam. His voice carried the weight of personal testimony. This isn't right. As if in response to Davis's words, a breeze stirred the trees along Cherry Oak Lane, carrying with it the distant sound of church bells. The same bells that had rung at Sarah Freeman's funeral, at Marcus Johnson's memorial, at generations of services where people prayed for a unity they struggled to practice. Karen's flashlight beam wavered, then dropped. In its dying light, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in Jamal's car window, not the tough officer she'd become, but the scared mother she still was, desperate to protect herself from more pain by inflicting it on others. Lieutenant Roberts cleared his throat, years of experience telling him this moment could either heal or shatter their community. The weight of history, personal and societal, hung in the air like summer storm clouds ready to break. None of them could have known that this was just the beginning, that the real storm was yet to come, bringing with it revelations that would force them to confront not just their prejudices, but their very understanding of faith, justice, and redemption. As the tension hung thick in the air, memories began to surface, weaving together threads of connection none had realized existed. Father Thomas stepped closer, his weathered Bible in hand, its pages worn from years of seeking guidance in moments like these. Sarah Freeman, he began, his voice carrying across the unnaturally quiet street, came to me 15 years ago with a story that haunts me to this day. His eyes met Karen's, then Jamal's. She spoke of a night at Mercy Hospital, a terrible car accident, and a young mother whose faith was being tested. Karen's hand dropped from her holster, her face paling as recognition dawned. The night rushed back to her, the screeching tires, Tommy's small body in the hospital bed, and the nurse who had stayed long past her shift, praying over her son. Your mother, she whispered to Jamal, her voice cracking. She was the one who saved Tommy's life. Jamal finished quietly. She told me that story many times. About the night she learned that sometimes God puts us exactly where we need to be. His hand touched the cross at his neck. She said it was the night she truly understood why she became a nurse. Mrs. Johnson moved closer, her cane tapping against the asphalt like a metronome counting the moments. Sarah was there for all of us, she said. The night they brought Marcus in, she held me up when my legs wouldn't work anymore. She prayed with me until sunrise, even though her voice caught. Even though she knew my boy was already gone. The neighbors who had gathered began to murmur, memories of their own encounters with Sarah Freeman surfacing like bubbles in still water. Mr. Peterson lowered his phone completely, remembering how she had cared for his wife during her cancer scare. Mrs. Anderson dabbed at her eyes, recalling the time Sarah had sat with her teenage daughter through a crisis. Officer Davis stepped forward, his father's pastoral wisdom echoing in his mind. We're not just facing each other tonight, he said. We're facing our own fears, our own pain, our own prejudices. Lieutenant Roberts watched as Karen's professional facade cracked further. He'd seen her personnel file, knew about the custody battle that had torn her world apart. He'd witnessed her transformation from a compassionate officer to someone hardened by loss and bitter judgment. The night of the accident, Karen said, her voice barely above a whisper. Your mother told me something I've tried to forget. She looked at Jamal, really seeing him for the first time. She said that God doesn't see color, he sees souls, and that sometimes our greatest tests come disguised as ordinary moments. The church bells tolled in the distance, marking the hour. Father Thomas opened his Bible, its pages falling naturally to Psalm 34, the same passage Sarah had read to Karen that night, the same words she had whispered to Mrs. Johnson as Marcus slipped away, the same comfort she had sought in her own final hours. Sarah knew, Father Thomas said gently, that this community was carrying wounds deeper than any of us would admit. She prayed not just for healing, but for understanding. He turned to Karen. She prayed for you, Officer Michaels, long after Tommy recovered. She saw your pain, your fear of losing him again. Jamal's law books lay forgotten in his car, but their presence seemed to underscore the irony of the moment, how justice and mercy sometimes stood at odds, how law and love struggled to find common ground. Mrs. Johnson's wind chimes sang softly in the breeze, a counterpoint to the heavy silence. Marcus used to say she offered her voice stronger now, that change doesn't come from laws alone. It comes from hearts brave enough to break and heal and break again. The gathered neighbors shifted uncomfortably, aware that they were witnessing more than just a traffic stop gone wrong. They were seeing the unraveling of carefully constructed walls, the exposure of wounds they'd all helped inflict. Lightning flickered in the distance, promising a summer storm, but no one moved. They stood frozen in this moment of revelation, each fighting their own internal battles. Karen's hand moved to her pocket, where Tommy's photo pressed against her badge, symbols of love and authority that had somehow become tangled in her mind. Officer Davis glanced at his watch, knowing that soon they would need to make decisions, take actions, file reports. But for now, the power of memory and truth held them all in its grip, forcing them to confront the complex web of pain and prejudice that had brought them to this moment. None of them could have predicted what would happen next, how this night would challenge not just their assumptions about each other, but their very understanding of faith, justice, and redemption. The real storm was yet to come, bringing with it revelations that would shake Cherry Oak Lane to its foundations. The tension snapped like a rubber band when dispatch crackled over Karen's radio. All units be advised. Armed suspect reported in vicinity of Cherry Oak Lane. Black male, dark vehicle, the words hung in the air like poison, transforming the moment of understanding back into one of suspicion. Karen's training took over, her hand returning to her weapon. On your knees, she ordered Jamal, the tenderness of moments ago replaced by professional detachment. The ghost of Tommy's face seemed to blur with the image of Jamal before her, past and present colliding in a dangerous dance. Officer Michael's father, Thomas, stepped forward, his Bible held like a shield. Don't let fear erase what we've just learned, but the priest's words were drowned out by the arrival of additional patrol cars, their sirens painting the night in red and blue panic. Mrs. Johnson's voice cut through the chaos, strong and clear. I will not watch another son die on this street. She moved with surprising speed, positioning herself between Jamal and the officers. Her cane clattered to the ground as she spread her arms wide, her shadow stretching across the pavement like a cross. Lightning split the sky, followed by a crack of thunder that made everyone jump. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, but no one moved. Officer Davis's radio crackled with updates about the armed suspect, but his eyes remained fixed on Jamal's mother's cross, glinting in the strobing lights. He's reaching, someone shouted as Jamal's hand moved instinctively to protect the cross from the rain. Multiple weapons raised, their metal surfaces reflecting the lightning like angry stars. The neighbors who had been watching from their porches gasped collectively, some pulling out phones to record, others turning away in horror. In that moment, Karen saw it all with devastating clarity, her own son's face superimposed over Jamal's, Mrs. Johnson's maternal defiance mirroring her own battles, Father Thomas's desperate faith echoing Sarah Freeman's prayers. The weight of her badge seemed to burn against her chest. Stand down, Lieutenant Roberts's voice boomed across the street, but the storm almost drowned him out. Rain plastered Jamal's shirt to his skin, making the outline of his mother's cross stand out like a target. From somewhere in the gathering crowd, a child began to cry. The sound cut through the tension like a knife, reminiscent of Tommy's tears the night Karen lost custody, of Marcus's little sister at his funeral, of all the innocent voices silenced by fear and prejudice. Mrs. Johnson stood firm, rain running down her face like tears. If you want to shoot him, she declared, her voice carrying the weight of years of accumulated pain, you'll have to shoot through me first. I won't move. I cannot move. God help me, I will not move. Father Thomas opened his Bible, its pages instantly soaked by the rain, but he began to read anyway, his voice rising above the storm. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. The words seemed to hang in the air, mixing with the rain and lightning, creating a moment of suspended reality where past and present, fear and faith, justice and mercy all stood in perfect, terrible balance. In the flash of lightning, Karen caught a glimpse of her reflection in Jamal's car window, not just who she had become, but who she still could be. The tragedy unfolded in slow motion, like a nightmare none of them could stop. A rookie officer, spooked by the lightning and tension, discharged his weapon into the air. The sound shattered the night, causing a chain reaction of chaos. People scattered, screaming. Mrs. Johnson collapsed to her knees, the sound triggering memories of Marcus's final moments. Jamal instinctively moved to help Mrs. Johnson, but his motion was misinterpreted. "He's reaching," someone shouted again. Karen found herself caught between training and truth, her finger trembling on the trigger as rain streamed down her face, mixing with unexpected tears. "Stop, Father!" Thomas's voice cracked with authority as he rushed forward, his white collar now gray with rain. But his foot caught on the curb, sending him sprawling onto the wet pavement. His Bible slid across the ground, coming to rest at Karen's feet, open to a page marked with a photo one that made her heart stop. It was a picture of Tommy, taken at his confirmation ceremony. He stood proudly next to Sarah Freeman, who had been his sponsor. The truth hit Karen like a physical blow. All these years she'd carried her bitterness while Sarah had continued to watch over her son from afar, keeping her promise to pray for them both. Officer Davis moved to help Father Thomas, but the priest waved him away, choosing instead to remain on his knees in the rain, praying audibly. The sight of the elderly man prostrate on the ground sent ripples of shame through the gathering crowd. Mrs. Johnson's voice rose above the chaos, thin but determined. "Marcus died because of moments like this," she cried. "Because we let fear win. Because good people stayed silent." Her words cut through the rain like knives, finding homes in the hearts of everyone present. The neighbors who had been recording with their phones slowly lowered them, the weight of their own complicity becoming unbearable. Mr. Peterson, who had been so quick to call the police on suspicious people in the past, found himself unable to meet his wife's eyes. Karen's vision blurred as she looked at the photo again. Tommy's smile, so innocent and full of hope, seemed to ask her what she had become. The badge that had been her shield now felt like a burden, heavy with the weight of corrupted authority. Lieutenant Roberts watched helplessly as years of community tension exploded in front of him. This wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. It was about every unsaid word, every averted gaze, every silent acceptance of injustice that had brought them to this point. Jamal stood in the rain, his mother's cross still gleaming against his chest, her final words echoing in his mind sometimes. "Baby, the hardest thing isn't standing up to hate, it's standing still in the face of fear." He understood now why she had stayed calm with every patient, even those who had refused to be treated by a black nurse. The tragedy wasn't just in the chaos of the moment, but in the realization of how deeply their community had failed itself. Each person present carried a piece of the responsibility, from the neighbors who had chosen comfortable silence over uncomfortable truth, to the officers who had let bias corrupt their duty to protect and serve. As the rain continued to fall, washing away the superficial barriers between them, they stood frozen in a tableau of their own, making a living monument to the cost of prejudice and the price of silence. None of them yet knew that this moment of collective failure would become the foundation for something none of them could have imagined. A sudden voice cut through the rain, young and clear. "Mom." The single word sliced through the tension like a bolt of lightning. Everyone turned to see a tall young man pushing through the crowd, his features a perfect blend of Karen and the man she had once loved. Tommy Michaels, now 20 and studying at the local college, stood at the edge of the chaos, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had chosen this night, of all nights, to finally visit his mother, to try to rebuild the bridge that prejudice and court orders had burned. "What are you doing to him?" Tommy's voice cracked with emotion as he looked from his mother to Jamal, recognition dawning in his eyes. "That's Mr. Freeman. He tutored me in pre-law last semester. He's the reason I decided to become a lawyer." Karen's gun lowered slowly, her hands trembling as she stared at her son, grown now, standing tall in the rain. The photo in Father Thomas's Bible seemed to burn in her memory, a stark reminder of the innocent child who had once believed his mother could do no wrong. "Tommy," she whispered, but the rest of her words died in her throat as another figure emerged from the shadows. Sarah Freeman's sister, Dr. Rachel Freeman, stepped into the light. She had driven Tommy to Cherry Oak Lane, knowing it was time for healing to begin. Rachel spoke softly, moving closer. "Sarah made me promise to watch over Tommy when she couldn't be there herself. She never stopped believing that love would win. In the end, she reached into her purse and pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. She wrote this for you the night before she passed." The letter trembled in Karen's rain-soaked hand, Sarah's familiar handwriting bleeding through the paper to be given to Karen Michaels when the time is right. The timing seemed almost divine, as if Sarah had somehow known this moment would come. Mrs. Johnson struggled to her feet, supported by Father Thomas, her eyes fixed on Tommy. "You look just like your mother did the day she first brought you to church," she said softly, "before the world tried to teach her to be afraid." Tommy moved forward, past the drawn weapons, past the stunned officers, until he stood beside Jamal. "Mom," he said again, his voice stronger now. "Mr. Freeman was the one who helped me understand why you fought so hard to keep me. He told me about his own mother, about her belief that love is stronger than fear." Lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene like a photograph. Karen Michaels, her weapon now lowered, facing her son, standing shoulder to shoulder with the man she had been ready to arrest moments before. The image seemed to capture everything that was broken and everything that could still be healed on Cherry Oak Lane. The revelation hung in the air like the aftermath of thunder, forcing everyone present to confront the intricate ways their lives had been connected all along, woven together by Sarah Freeman's quiet acts of faith and love. The first surprise of the night had landed like a hammer blow to the walls they'd built between each other, but none of them could have predicted what would come next. The rain began to ease as Karen's trembling fingers opened Sarah Freeman's letter. Tommy moved closer to his mother, while Jamal stood perfectly still, his mother's cross catching the last flickers of lightning. The gathered crowd held its breath as Karen began to read aloud, her voice barely a whisper at first. "Dear Karen," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then the moment I've prayed for has finally come. The day when truth breaks through fear, when love overcomes the barriers we build around our hearts." Karen's voice broke, but Tommy gently took the letter, continuing where she left off. "I've watched you all these years, caring for Tommy from afar, seeing how the pain of losing him has hardened your heart. But I've also seen the love that still lives there, fighting to break free." Lightning flickered distantly as Tommy read on, his voice growing stronger. "The same God who gave me the strength to fight cancer gave me the wisdom to see beyond skin color, beyond prejudice, beyond the artificial walls we build. The night I helped save Tommy, I saw in your eyes the same love I have for my Jamal, pure, fierce, unlimited by race or circumstance." Officer Davis holstered his weapon, the first to do so as the words washed over them all. Lieutenant Roberts followed suit, signaling the other officers to stand down. The night air crackled with possibility as the letter continued. "Karen, my final prayer is that you'll find your way back to that love, that you'll see in others what I've always seen in you, a heart capable of extraordinary compassion. Tommy needs that mother, the one who loved so fiercely that nothing else mattered. Our community needs that woman, the one who chose love over prejudice once before." Mrs. Johnson stepped forward, supported by Father Thomas, her voice joining the narrative. "Sarah told me about her prayers for you, Karen. Even as she lay dying, she believed in the power of love to heal our deepest wounds." Karen's legs gave way and she sank to her knees on the wet pavement. Tommy knelt beside her, one arm around her shoulders, the other still holding the letter. Rachel Freeman moved closer, completing the circle that had begun forming around them. "The cross that Jamal wears," Rachel explained softly. "Sarah wanted him to have it as a reminder that faith sees no color. The same cross she wore the night she helped save Tommy." Jamal touched the cross at his neck, his voice steady as he spoke. My mother told me that night changed her forever. She said she saw in you, Officer Michaels, the same fierce love she felt for me. She believed that love would eventually break through the walls of fear and prejudice. The neighbors who had been watching began to move closer, drawn by the raw emotion of the moment. Mr. Peterson lowered his phone for the final time, shame and understanding washing over his face. His wife wiped tears from her eyes, remembering Sarah's kindness during her own crisis. Father Thomas opened his Bible again, his voice carrying across the now quiet street. Perfect love casts out fear. The words seemed to hang in the air, a testimony to Sarah Freeman's enduring faith. Lieutenant Roberts watched as Karen slowly stood, helped by her son and Jamal. In all his years of service, he had never witnessed a moment quite like this, when justice and mercy met, when past and present collided, when truth broke through the barriers of prejudice and pain. "I'm sorry," Karen whispered, looking first at Jamal, then at Mrs. Johnson, then at the community gathered around them. "I forgot who I was. I let fear win." She turned to Tommy, tears streaming down her face. "I became everything I once fought against." The church bells began to toll midnight, their sound carrying across Cherry Oak Lane like a reminder of all the prayers that had led to this moment. The letter's final words, read by Tommy, seemed to echo with each toll. "Remember, Karen, it's never too late to choose love again. It's never too late to heal, to forgive, to begin again. My prayer is that when you read this, you'll be ready to take that step. And know that somewhere I'm still praying for you, for Tommy, for all of us, with eternal hope and love. Sarah!" The night air grew still, as if holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. None of them could have predicted the final revelation that was about to shake their community to its core. As the church bell's final toll faded into the night, Mrs. Johnson suddenly gasped, her hand clutching her chest, her eyes fixed on Rachel Freeman with a look of stunned recognition. "The file," she whispered, "Sarah's file. I never told anyone." Rachel nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. "The evidence that would have cleared Marcus's name," she said softly. "Sarah found it the week before she died." The gathered crowd stirred as Mrs. Johnson's voice grew stronger. "Sarah was working that night, checking patient records. She discovered that the officer who her voice caught, who shot Marcus, had a history of racial incidents, reports that had been buried, complaints that had disappeared." Lieutenant Roberts stepped forward, his face pale. "Mrs. Johnson, what are you saying?" "Sarah compiled everything," Rachel continued, reaching into her bag to pull out a weathered manila envelope. "She kept copies of every document, every report. She was going to testify to help clear Marcus's name, but then the cancer." Karen's hand flew to her mouth as she remembered something. "The night before she died, Sarah asked me to protect a file. I was still on desk duty then. She made me promise, but I was so angry, so lost in my own pain." Her voice trailed off, heavy with regret. Tommy looked at his mother, understanding flooding his features. "That's why she chose you as my confirmation sponsor, isn't it? She was trying to help you find your way back to who you really are." Jamal stood silent, the weight of this revelation settling over him. His mother hadn't just been a nurse who cared for everyone equally. She had been a quiet warrior for justice, working until her final days to right a terrible wrong. Father Thomas moved to Mrs. Johnson's side as she swayed slightly. "Sarah told me there was more to Marcus's story," he said gently. "She made me promise to wait for the right moment, when hearts were ready to hear the truth." Rachel handed the envelope to Lieutenant Roberts, whose hands trembled slightly as he opened it. "These records," he said, scanning the contents, "they change everything. The department will have to reopen the case." The night air seemed to hold its breath as Mrs. Johnson's voice cut through the silence. Sarah knew she was dying, but she made sure the truth wouldn't die with her. She protected this evidence, protected Tommy, protected all of us, believing that someday love would win. Officer Davis stepped forward, his father's words about justice and mercy echoing in his mind. "This isn't just about clearing Marcus's name," he said. "It's about changing the system that failed him." Karen looked at her badge, then at Tommy, then at Jamal. The weight of her role in this story, both the harm she had caused and the potential for redemption, settled over her like a mantle. "Sarah gave us everything we need to make this right," she said. She believed in justice enough to fight for it until her last breath. The neighbors who had gathered watched in stunned silence as the full impact of Sarah Freeman's final gift to their community unfolded. She hadn't just been a nurse who cared for their bodies, she had been a guardian of truth who fought for their souls. As the night's second revelation settled over Cherry Oak Lane, no one could have predicted how this moment would transform not just their community, but the very system they had all tacitly accepted for so long. The dawn broke over Cherry Oak Lane 6 months later, painting the sky in shades of hope. The church bells rang out across a community transformed, calling people to gather not for regular service, but for the dedication of the Sarah Freeman Memorial Justice Center. The building, once a vacant community center, now stood as a testament to change. Its walls, freshly painted in warm colors, housed both a legal aid clinic where Jamal worked part-time while finishing law school, and a community mediation center where Officer Karen Michaels, having turned in her badge, now helped bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. Mrs. Johnson sat in the front row, her face peaceful as she watched Tommy and Jamal unveil the center's mission statement, "Where justice meets mercy," in memory of Sarah Freeman. Marcus's case had been reopened, his name cleared, and the system that had failed him was undergoing reform, thanks to the evidence Sarah had preserved. Father Thomas stood at the podium, his Bible open to Psalm 34, the same passage that had fallen open that rainy night. Sarah Freeman's legacy. He began isn't just in the lives she saved as a nurse, or the truth she protected as a witness to justice. Her legacy lives in how she taught us to see each other through God's eyes. The gathered crowd, a tapestry of faces that reflected the true diversity of their community, nodded in agreement. Mr. Peterson, now heading the center's community outreach program, sat beside his wife, who taught cultural sensitivity classes at the police academy. The transformation of Cherry Oak Lane had begun with confronting uncomfortable truths and had blossomed into genuine change. Rachel Freeman wiped tears from her eyes as she watched Lieutenant Roberts, now the department's chief of community relations, present Mrs. Johnson with the official document exonerating Marcus. The truth Sarah had protected had not only cleared her son's name, but had sparked a departmental overhaul of police training and accountability. Karen stood next to Tommy, their relationship healing day by day. Her son had followed through on his plan to become a lawyer, inspired by both Jamal's mentorship and Sarah Freeman's courage. Together, they were working to reform the family court system that had once torn them apart. My mother believed Jamal addressed the crowd, his hand touching the cross that still hung around his neck. That love was not just an emotion, but an action. She showed us that faith without works is dead, and that true justice requires both courage and compassion. The community had changed in ways both visible and subtle. The Neighborhood Watch program now focused on supporting rather than suspecting. The church's segregated pews had given way to genuine fellowship. Even the annual block party had transformed from a polite obligation into a true celebration of their shared humanity. As the ceremony concluded, Karen approached the podium, her voice steady with purpose. Sarah Freeman saw past my anger to the pain beneath. She protected my son while waiting for my heart to heal. She taught us that true change begins with facing our own prejudices and fears. The surprise came as Karen unveiled the final addition to the center, a small garden where Sarah's favorite yellow roses would bloom. At its center stood a simple plaque that read, "Perfect love casts out fear," in memory of Sarah Freeman, who showed us the way. The gathered community moved into the garden, where Mrs. Johnson planted the first rose bush, helped by Tommy and Jamal. As they worked together, the morning sun caught Sarah's cross around Jamal's neck. sending sparkles of light dancing across the garden like a blessing. Cherry Oak Lane had become more than just an address. It was now a symbol of what could happen when faith, justice, and love worked together to heal old wounds and create new possibilities. Sarah Freeman's quiet revolution had transformed not just a neighborhood, but the hearts of all who lived there. As the crowd dispersed, moving into the center for the reception, Father Thomas remained in the garden, watching the sun rise fully over their transformed community. He smiled, knowing that somewhere Sarah Freeman was smiling too, seeing her prayers for justice and reconciliation finally answered on the street she had called home. Perfect love, a message from Cherry Oak Lane. In the depth of our greatest prejudices lies a wounded child seeking acceptance. Sarah Freeman understood that beneath every badge of authority, behind every closed door, and within every fearful heart, there exists a story of pain waiting to be healed. When Karen Michaels pointed her weapon at Jamal that night, she wasn't just aiming at a young black man in an expensive car, she was shooting at her own reflection. At every moment she felt powerless. At every time the world told her that love wasn't enough to cross the boundaries of race and prejudice. Mrs. Johnson didn't just stand in front of those guns to protect Jamal. She stood to reclaim the moment she couldn't save her own son, Marcus. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is to stand still in the face of fear, to let our tears fall in the rain, to let our hearts break open so that healing can finally begin. Sarah Freeman's cross wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a bridge between worlds, a testament that love doesn't see color when it's saving a child, that faith doesn't check skin tone when it's offering prayers, that humanity doesn't need permission to show compassion. Tommy's return wasn't just a reunion, it was redemption wrapped in rain and revelation, proof that our children often lead us back to our better selves, that they see through our carefully constructed walls of prejudice to the love we've locked away. The truth is, we all stand on both sides of fear, those who tremble at the sight of flashing lights and those who tremble as they reach for their weapons. We are all Mrs. Johnson, watching our children walk into a world that might not love them. We are all Karen Michaels, fighting battles within ourselves that no badge can protect us from. But most importantly, we all have the capacity to be Sarah Freeman, to love beyond boundaries, to serve beyond fear, to believe beyond doubt that every single soul is worthy of dignity, of justice, of grace. Because in the end, it's not about black or white, badge or cross, fear or faith. It's about the courage to let our hearts break open wide enough to hold both justice and mercy, to let our tears wash away the lines we've drawn between us, to let love do what love has always done best: heal, unite, and set us free. Remember, just as Sarah Freeman did, sometimes the greatest act of faith is to believe that love is stronger than fear, that truth is more powerful than prejudice, and that it's never too late to choose love again. For on Cherry Oak Lane, we learn that the distance between justice and mercy, between fear and faith, between hatred and love is exactly the length of an outstretched hand reaching across the divide. And perhaps, like the rain that fell that night, these words will wash away something in your own heart, revealing the love that has always been there, waiting to transform your own Cherry Oak Lane. Because in the end, we are all Sarah Freeman's children, called to be better than our fears, bigger than our prejudices, and braver than our pain. Let the tears fall. Let the healing begin. Let love win. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Share it with those who need to hear it. Subscribe to join our storytelling family, and hit that like button if Sarah Freeman's message resonated with you. Your comments fuel our passion to create more moving stories. Want to know what happens next on Cherry Oak Lane? Let us know in the comments below. Together we can keep spreading love and understanding, one story at a time.